The likelihood is she was infected during the time when his doctors failed to tell Hayden about his HIV status. Not only did they not tell him his result, but they didn't tell him they were testing at all. Hayden is suspicious now about their motives in keeping quiet. He's a mild haemophiliac, so there's a strong case that he could have remained on cryoprecipitate, which carried less danger of infection. Hayden is part of a haemophilia network called Tainted Blood. They've passed Newsnight documents collected over 2 decades. These show that things were in a state of flux during the 1980s because 2 products were available: ordinary factor VIII concentrate and heat-treated versions designed to kill off viruses. The documents Hayden's uncovered show doubts were raised at the time. In one meeting on October the 17th, 1983, of the UK's regional haemophilia directors, one said she had unlimited supplies of cryoprecipitate, so there was clearly no shortage. But Hayden's also found out there were trials by scientists at the time on factor VIII for what's now called hepatitis C. Minutes of meetings talk of the need for previously untreated patients, or virgin haemophiliacs.
You can catch?
These phrases have come to haunt Hayden. He believes he was part of a research study for a product he didn't need and for which he certainly didn't give consent.
It was evident to me that I met the criteria of being a previously untreated patient with commercial products. There's no excuse for not informing a patient of a risk. There's no excuse for not asking for their consent. It's deplorable and criminal, I would even suggest.
Professor Geoffrey Savage was a key figure among haemophilia experts during the 1980s and has decided to speak out for the first time. We asked him if there's any reason why doctors carrying out studies would not have needed to gain consent first.
It does seem to be very unusual, because one would have thought that clinical trials done on a professional basis would have to follow the rules and regulations and have to keep the patients fully informed and actually ensure that you have their written consent.
2 of Tainted Blood's documents reveal startling discussions about the use of chimpanzees and people in scientific studies. This one talks about early attempts to reduce the infectivity in blood products with hepatitis C. It talks about how these batches were tested by injecting them into chimpanzees, though there were very few of these animals available. Just a few months later, in January 1982, this letter talks about how 4 commercial companies are poised to introduce heat-treated factor VIII. It talks about a shortage of chimpanzees and says it's unlikely these companies will be able to guarantee quality control for future batches. It says it's therefore very important to find out by studies in human beings the extent to which infectivity had been reduced. Hayden isn't the only one who believes he was secretly tested. In Scotland, Robert Mackey was infected with HIV in 1984. He says he was being used like a laboratory rat. At the time, he was only a mild haemophiliac and didn't need to be on factor VIII.
Nobody ever told me that it was thousands and thousands and thousands of donors went into one pool to make one batch of factor VIII.
And do you think that the doctors who were giving you that factor VIII knew that there were risks?
Yes, beyond any doubt, they knew of the risks.
He discovered by accident that his doctor, Professor Ludlam of the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, was doing a lot more than looking after patients. In a medical newsletter in 1990, he described a unique group of patients in Scotland that had formed the basis of several years of important research he'd published on AIDS. When Rob saw this, he decided to check his records. He later discovered he'd been infected in 1984, but wasn't told until 1987. And even more strangely, the words AIDS study are clearly written in his medical notes before he was infected. Rob's convinced he was part of scientific attempts to understand the virus behind AIDS, but they didn't tell him. Rob now relies on his wife, Alice, to care for him. He's often sick, but over the last 10 years, he's tried to find out the truth. He's discovered that in April 1983, before he was infected, AIDS specialists at one of America's top medical institutions wrote in The Lancet about how valuable it would be to locate a group of haemophiliacs in a country not yet affected by AIDS. Professor Ludlam offered up his patients in response. Mark is another patient of Professor Ludlam's. He's dying of AIDS, but doesn't want to show his face because, astonishingly, he wasn't told for 6 years that he was HIV positive. During that time, he had many girlfriends. And looking back on it, what do you think were their motives in not telling you?
They were certainly collecting information. I have copies of that stuff from 1985 onwards, where he is broadcasting to the rest of the world what has been going on, but he doesn't have the manners, courtesy or sense to tell his patient, who lives 30 miles away, what has happened.
Both men have shown us their medical records. Just like Rob, Mark's records clearly state AIDS study. Professor Ludlam failed to tell either of them that they were infected with HIV or that they were part of his studies.
My faith and trust has dwindled even further. As snippets of information are collected, it becomes more and more apparent that these people, they seem to know what they were doing. They were simply scrutinising me from a distance and watching what the reaction was.
1983, by June 1983, when the European Commissioners put out R83-8, a warning that all haemophiliacs in Europe, including the United Kingdom, was to be informed of the risks of AIDS. Why weren't we warned of the risks?
And if you had been told, did you have any options?
If I had been told I would have ceased treatment of factor VIII, any blood products of that time, if I had been informed of the seriousness and the devastating effect that AIDS has got on the human anatomy, I would never, ever have taken that product.
We asked Professor Ludlam why he hadn't told Rob or Mark that they were part of his research studies and that he was testing them. We asked why he delayed telling them their results, so putting other lives at risk. And we asked about the American call for help with research and his response. He said he had a duty of confidentiality to individual patients, even though Rob and Mark themselves want answers. And he declined to take part in our film because of a potential investigation by the General Medical Council. The other big question that Britain's haemophiliacs want answered is why their doctors didn't make the switch to heat-treated factor VIII concentrates sooner. Professor Savage did make that switch and got wrapped over the knuckles because the heat-treated material was much more expensive.
There was scientific evidence at that time, towards the end of '83, as I said, to show that HIV was a virus. It was heat susceptible. So it doesn't really need to be the brain of Britain to work out that perhaps a heat-treated product would be infinitely better than an unheated one.
Did have any of your colleagues ever expressed any regret at not taking the same route that you did at the time?
No.
Does that shock me?
No.
Why not?
It's very difficult for a doctor to admit perhaps that he was wrong.
I've been told about a meeting in Barcelona in September 1983 with representatives of all the commercial companies and haemophilia experts from across Europe. Two of those present have told me about furious exchanges over what to do with leftover non-heat-treated factor VIII. There was talk of certain countries agreeing to take on those leftover stocks, and even talk of money available from grateful commercial companies to support research. Some of those present were shocked and objected. Others were more sympathetic. There have been inquiries in other countries and some out-of-court settlements here, though nothing like the amounts awarded elsewhere. In Wales, Colin's parents were given a one-off payment of £20,000, but for them the money is less important